All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our third class of Christianity, Critical Theory, and Cultural Marxism. Again, I'm Ben Kelly. You should know me by now. So let's do this. Let's have a quick word of prayer, and then we will proceed to get into our lesson tonight. So if you would bow your heads with me. Lord, we come to you humbly, asking that you would prepare our hearts to just to learn something that is difficult, that is complex, that is somewhat deceptive. Lord, I pray that you can help us to make sense of a lot of the moving parts in this new worldview that we're seeing, and these ideas of critical theory and cultural Marxism. I pray that you would illumine us, you would help us to understand, you would make our hearts receptive to any kind of knowledge that might be shared, but also help us to be discerning. Give us your spirit of truth, that we may search out the truth, that we may be not judgmental or condemning, but understanding and wanting to show your love and grace, because we do not see you in these things that we're going to talk about tonight. Your gospel doesn't go forth in these theories that are being proposed by the world today. So we pray that we discern that we can turn this around and use this as an opportunity to share your good news with a world that desperately needs it. We ask, we take this seriously. And again, that you would just prepare our hearts, help us to love each other, to encourage each other, and just keep us humble in doing this. We pray all these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, guys. So tonight is where we are really going to start looking at some of the things that I know a lot of you signed up for this class for. I know you were probably thrown off the first 2 weeks talking a lot about worldview and how we construct that philosophy. But tonight we're really going to get into some of the historical information about critical theory and cultural Marxism, pretty much talking about where they came from. And if you did the reading this week, great. Tonight should be very easy. I am going to comment a lot on some of the things that were in the reading, because some of the reading wasn't easy. Some of it may be some very new ideas for you. At the same time, if you didn't do the reading and you just felt like it was maybe a little bit over your head, you should still grasp this tonight. I'm trying to help you make sense of all this. So, come on. There we go. So for review, I just want to reiterate, at this point in the course, this is what you should know. This is what you should be able to do. And if you can't do this, don't feel bad. Just go back and review what we've covered previously. We've recorded both sessions. They are available on the course thread. I have also given you access to my slideshow presentations. So those are available as well. And so you have all the tools there to help you. But if you're going to make this class work for you, if this is something that you're going to be able to use as a tool out there in the real world and not just knowledge that sits in your head, you should be able to do these things. So far, you need to be able to define a worldview right now. If I talk to you at church on Sunday and I ask you, hey, what is a worldview? You should be able to define that for me. Give me some kind of definition about that. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to know what you're talking about. You should be able to explain the 5 components of a worldview. You know, we're talking about theology, metaphysics, epistemology, anthropology, ethics. You should be able to explain to me what all 5 of those are and why they're important within a worldview. And lastly, you should be able to explain some of the Christian beliefs within each of those components. All right, so in theology, you need to talk about how the Christian God is different from other gods and how other worldviews consider God throughout the world, because it's Trinitarian, because it understands God as both personal but also all powerful. All right, You need to understand our metaphysics, where we talk about the universe has a purpose. It was created out of nothing by God, who spoke it into existence. So these are things that you should know. You should feel pretty competent in those subjects right now. If you don't, again, I'm not trying to get down on you. I'm not trying to judge you or anything. Just go back and learn them, because these are tools that will help you in dialogue when you run into other people of any worldview, not just this new critical worldview, but really any worldview out there. And so to begin the night, what we're going to do real quick, and Smith talked about this in his essay, Robert Smith, that he wrote our essay that we read this week for our reading. He talked about some things in the very first paragraph of what we as Christians need to do when we are approaching subjects like this. I'm calling this mapping the movements. That's actually a play on words of a very famous critical race theory essay called Mapping the Margins by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. If you ever read about critical race theory on your own, you'll probably run into that essay, but I'm playing on that, calling Mapping the Movements. This, as Christians, we must be careful not to be intellectually dishonest or hasty in our evaluations of alternate worldviews and ideologies. Now, some of you are probably saying, yeah, duh, I get that. However, I just want to impress upon you, let's act with wisdom. Let's take our time in doing this. We don't want to mistake correlation for causation. All right. So when we're studying all these theories tonight, when we're looking at all of these people that have espoused Marxism and cultural Marxism and critical theory, we don't want to say that they are the direct causation of what's happened today. You know, that would be a little reductionistic. We don't want to be quick to do something like that. There's correlation, but it is not necessarily causation. We want to be slow. We want to act with wisdom there. We don't want to accept partial explanations. All right. And I've seen this time and time again, where people in the Christian community have approached this subject and they say, well, everything that's happening here is cultural Marxism, or everything that's happening here is critical race theory, or everything that's happening here is postmodernism. And to each one of those, you can say, yeah, it is, but it's more than that. There's more going on than just those single answers. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to pull all the pieces together, because this is very complex. It's difficult to understand. And that's why the next point is, do not reduce complex ideological and cultural shifts. All right. Don't be reductionistic. The first time I ever ran into critical race theory, it was from a Christian who was complaining about the Southern Baptist Convention adopting critical race theory as a tool that could be utilized for Bible study. And the way that he approached it was, well, critical race theory is a Marxist tool. Marxist was an atheist, and all atheists are going to hell. Literally, he said that. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what critical theory was. So I went and read about it, and I came back to him and I said, man, I think you're being awfully reductionistic. I think you're seeing doomsday, before we can really take a closer look at this. And he said, no, this is how it is. It's Marxist. Marxist was an atheist. It's from hell, and we're just going to throw it into the fire. I said, okay, I mean, I agree there are certain problems with it, but when we explain it in that kind of reductionistic attitude, we're not doing a service to our fellow Christians, and we're not doing a service when we try to really minister out into the world. When we try to share the gospel, we're not really doing good ministry in that way. So we want to be careful with that as well. And then lastly, we don't want to resort to any kind of apathy or skepticism. These are complex ideas. This is difficult. This is going to push you a little bit. For a lot of you, you're not familiar with the study of philosophy or any kind of literary theory or social theory or anything like that. And that's okay. We can work with that, but don't get halfway through this and throw up your hands and say, it's just too hard. I can't know this, or become kind of lazy and apathetic towards it. Truth is available. We believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the way who shows us and makes us the Father available to us. We can pursue truth. It corresponds to reality. And so we don't want to resort to any kind of skepticism and saying it's just too complex, we can't know it. We don't want to get lazy or apathetic and just say, I don't care. We have to work for this, okay? So that's kind of the tone that I want to set to this, because again, I'm going to feed you a lot of information tonight. You're not going to have to do you're not going to have to do a lot of thinking like you had to the previous weeks. You're going to get a lot of historical information tonight. At the same time, don't get overwhelmed to the point where you say, I just can't know this, or I don't really need to know this. This is important stuff. This is how we begin to make sense of this new worldview that we're seeing. And so with that, the agenda for tonight is that we're going to talk about classical Marxism, how Marxism came into being, what Marxism is. We're going to talk about its economic and its philosophical roots. We're also going to talk about Neo-Marxism, all right? And when I say Neo-Marxism, that is synonymous with cultural Marxism for the purposes of this class. We'll say that they're the same thing. Neo-Marxism is the same as cultural Marxism. We're going to talk about a figure that a lot of you have probably never heard of before. His name is Antonio Gramsci, and we're going to talk about how he turned Marxism to really focus on culture instead of economics. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a group of thinkers called the Frankfurt School, and they are really responsible for starting the kind of criticism that we would call critical theory today. And so we're going to be looking at those three movements. And again, if you did the reading this week, these words should already be very familiar to you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to be commenting a little bit more on them and building into them a little bit more and kind of making it more practical for you and how we can proceed in talking about worldviews. So with that in mind, we're going to start with classical Marxism. Now I'm going to talk about classical Marxism, and then I'll talk about Neo-Marxism, and then I'll take a break for questions. Or I might take a break after classical Marxism for questions if we have time permitted. So this should go faster. I'm only planning an hour. I practiced it more this week. So in order to understand Marxism, it's important to know the ideas that influenced Karl Marx. And when we do that, we have to talk about a philosopher named Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, okay? He was born many years before Marx. He's a very important philosopher in the history of philosophy, especially over the last 200 years. Any kind of philosophy written over the last 200 years in Europe or North America is going to be interacting with Hegel. A lot of theology, especially academic theology, especially liberal theology, written over the last 200 years is also going to interact with Hegel. Hegel is a very important thinker. I'm sure some of you have heard that name before. It's just we have to talk about him. Even though he's not a Marxist per se, we have to understand some of his ideas to better understand Marx. All right. And the big idea that we need to understand from Hegel is what is called dialectical philosophy. All right. Dialectical philosophy was Hegel's system. This is how he arrived at certain ideas about how history should turn about. So Hegel kind of developed this folk religion in Germany when he was alive. He wasn't a Christian, but he was a religious kind of spiritual person, and he tried to develop this philosophical folk religion for Germany where he would arrive at an ideal end of history. He called it his eschaton, an ideal end of history through a dialectical process. Now, some of you probably don't know what dialectical means. Maybe you've never heard that word before, but we can describe it as this thesis, antithesis, synthesis type of philosophy. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard of that. You have a thesis, and then you have the antithesis. You bring them together, and they form a synthesis. All right. So Hegel's philosophy, and particularly his philosophy of history, stated that you have a synthesis, kind of like a normative culture or a normative society, a set of ideas that are the norm for a culture. And then you have what's called an antithesis, kind of the subversion of those norms for a society, different philosophy, different ideas. And the role of the antithesis is to come in and subvert that thesis. They don't really merge together. One gets subverted. The thesis really gets replaced and kicked out by the antithesis. However, once the antithesis kicks out the norm, you are left with a synthesis. And that synthesis becomes the new norm. It becomes the new thesis. And this is an important idea. We have to understand this because this is going to pop up everywhere. This is where we get a lot of our oppressed doctrines today. Like we see it in theology, we see it in critical social justice. This is directly where it comes from. It's dialectical thinking. And we see it in communism, particularly Marx, where he says the ideal end of history is the communist utopia. All right. So all of these theses, this antitheses, they're all happening. And this process happens over and over and over again until you get to this ideal end of history, what Hegel called his eschaton, and that is his ultimate synthesis, the ideal end. All right. We have to understand this because critical race theory, cultural Marxism, these are dialectical philosophies. Oh, I don't want to end there. These are dialectical philosophies. Now, this is important. This is an important distinction because a lot of people today are calling things like critical race theory or intersectionality or queer theory or post-colonialism. They're calling these theories analytical philosophy. And that's not true. All right. They are not analytical ideas. And there's a difference. And I'm going to explain that to you. But this is so important because what we see in the church today and what's happening is that these ideas are infiltrating the church because they're kind of being brushed aside as unimportant analytical tools to help us understand scripture better. For example, as an example, recently the Southern Baptist Convention just elected a new president. His name is Ed Litton. I'm sure he's a nice guy. He's a pastor down in Alabama. They elected him president. It was about a month or 2 months ago. And in an interview with the media, he was asked about his thoughts on critical race theory and how the seminaries in the Southern Baptist Convention are all concerned about critical race theory, and how a lot of churches in the Southern Baptist Convention are critical race theory or are concerned about critical race theory. And Litton's response was, well, it's really just an analytical tool to help us understand the Bible more. It's not really that important. And he just kind of brushes it aside. The problem is that it's not an analytical tool. An analytical tool, if we understand it in like philosophy or even theology, we'll put it in theology, for example. An analytical tool assumes that you have like a base theology. So at Sacred Mission, we have Reformed theology as our base theology. That is, the pastors are going to generally preach a Reformed theology from the pulpit. It's what our statements of beliefs are surrounded around. And it's kind of where we sit. It's our foundation, all right? And analytical philosophy says we've got a great foundation here, but there's maybe these little tiny problems scattered throughout here that we need to go in and we really need to analyze and we need to fix, to work on. So it would be akin to taking like, yeah, we have Reformed theology, but we have these little sections, these little verses in the Bible that may challenge our general assumption, our general theology. And analytical theology or philosophy, whatever, would go in and it would just kind of analyze these small parts, these small compartments. All right. That's analytical thinking. In philosophy, dialectical thinking is something completely different. It recognizes that you have a normative form. Again, for sacred mission, we have Reformed theology as our kind of foundation, our base, our norm. Dialectical thinking comes in and says, we see your normative way of thinking. We see your foundation, your base. What we're going to do is we're going to offer an anti-theology or an anti-Calvinism, for example, an anti-Reformed theology, and we're going to subvert your theology to the point where it's completely deconstructed, it's gone, and something new is going to come in its place. Some kind of synthesis is going to appear. We don't know what it is, but it's going to appear. This is why I say understanding the dialectic is so important, because it is the philosophy that is driving much of the thinking we see today. And if we have church leaders that are just kind of, shrugging off these critical theory tools, these theories, as just analytical tools used to study the Bible, that's very dangerous, because foundationally, dialectical tools like critical theory, their whole intention is to subvert the normative way of thinking. So I know that's a lot to grasp, but we need to make sure from the very first, we understand this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, this dialectical process where you have a normative, an anti-normative, and it comes in to subvert, and then you have something new. We don't know what it is, but it's going to appear and take the place of the synthesis. If we're going to understand Marxism and how it is followed through into critical theory, we have to understand that at the bedrock. So going from Hegel, that's kind of the high theory stuff tonight. Going from Hegel, we jump to Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was a follower of Hegel. He did believe in Hegel's philosophy, but he changed it a little bit. He used a philosophy called dialectical materialism. He used Hegel's process, but he applied it to economics. All right. Marx was very concerned about economic policies, about classism, about the social structure of class power. All right. And he centered that around, economics. And what Marx came to believe is that within a class system, there are inherent inequalities. And I think that we can step back from Marx and we can step back from class systems, and we can appreciate at least that line of thinking, that if you have a class society where it says there is a privileged few up top where the aristocracy is controlling things, and then there's a common working class under them, there may be inequalities in there, and we can generally use that line of thinking to investigate that. Now, the problem with Marx is that he says these inequalities are inherent to the system. There is no benevolent aristocrat. There is no benevolent aristocrat that is in harmony and working well with his servants or the people who are working his land and so forth. For Marx, they are always in tension. It's inherent. You can't get away from that. So even in this system, if you had a good lord, let's say a good duke, who was a good person who really looked out for the welfare of his subject, and he looked to take care of his people, Marx would say, nah, that doesn't work. The oppression for this system, it's inherent. It will always be there, no matter how morally good you try to act. It is always there. And so Marx is really concerned with oppression, and he sees that oppression as inherent in capitalistic societies, real societies that are working towards making capital. And he understands that as owners of production, the bourgeoisie. I'm sure you've heard that word before. The people who own the things, the means of making capital, the people who are owning the businesses, who are making the money, they are always guilty of oppressing the working class, who Marx called the proletariat. All right. So you can kind of see this dialectical thinking in Marx. You see the owners, the bourgeoisie, as the thesis, and you see the working class, the proletariat, as the antithesis. All right, and so you see that he's taking that dialectic and he's beginning to use it for his theory of economics. Now, Marx's solution to all this, because oppression is inherent in a system, it cannot be overcome. The system is totally flawed because oppression is always there. Marx's solution was that we have to proceed with bloodshed and revolution. That's the only way around it. The proletariat has to overthrow the bourgeoisie. All right, and he gives this quote in his Communist Manifesto. He says, "They, who are the communists, openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions." All right, so the communists, or we can use the proletariat here because that's who he's thinking of. These are the people. The only way that they can get to their utopia, their ideal end of history, is by forcibly creating a revolution and overthrowing the systems of power, the people who are in power at that time, the owners, the bourgeoisie, the people who control the means of production. So again, the bourgeoisie, they are our thesis. The proletariat, they're our antithesis. And again, they're not combining to form a synthesis. One is overthrowing or subverting the other, and it's forming a new synthesis. And for Marx's communism, the synthesis is a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not some sort of classless society yet. The oppressors will be removed by the oppressed, and then those who were previously oppressed, they become the new oppressors. They become a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, this is Marxist stage of socialism. He's not to communism yet. He's going to apply Hegel's dialectical system again once the proletariat becomes the new thesis, the new norm. Something else is going to have to come in and overthrow the proletariat dictatorship to eventually get to the communist utopia. This is dialectical thinking. This is Hegel's thinking that Marx is applying to economics and to politics. So utopia is only reached after multiple syntheses. I think I'm on to the next one. Yes. So make sure everybody has that. Utopia is only reached after multiple syntheses. So the goal of Marxism and his philosophy really is the abolition of private property. He doesn't want people to own capital. He doesn't want you to own money. He doesn't want you to own property. You cannot have investments. You cannot have something stored up for your family, because one of the things that he's going to do to get there, to abolish private property, he's going to abolish the family at the same time. And the reason why is, think about this. If you have families, all right, my family lives and exists within my private property that I own. The ideal of a capitalist society is for everyone, no matter how big or how small, how rich or how poor, is to own at least a small piece of property to call their own, because that's something that they can call their own. And for our families, as an example, your family gathers in your house. That's a place where you have ownership. You are your own people. You have your own rules, your own rhythms of life. You're free to teach your children what you want to teach them. And so Marx's idea is, if we're going to get to the abolition of private property, if we're going to completely get rid of that, one of the steps to get there is we have to get rid of the family. Because when we get rid of the family and we just have individuals, well, we don't have this great transfer of property from generation to generation. And he's going to say at the same time, all education through social institutions and not the home. Everything, everywhere where people are educated is going to come through public institutions. No education is going to come through the home. And what's scary about this, and if any of you are involved in public education, I work for a school, you will notice that this is kind of happening now. There's been no other time in history where like public school teachers have been asked to do so much in raising up kids and being responsible for the kids under their tutelage. All right. There's never been another time where teachers have been asked to do so much, and the home is disintegrating and it's breaking down. And this is kind of like what Marx wanted to see. He wanted to see that breakdown of the home, because ultimately that would lead to the abolition of private property. Now, what's his legacy? What do we think of Marx? Well, I don't think much of him. I think he was actually a horrible human being, even though a lot of our culture thinks he was wonderful. Really, Marx is responsible for creating dystopia instead of utopia. He preached utopia, and we'd have this wonderful communistic end where everybody is just holding hands and everybody's owning everything, and everyone owns all the property. Nobody really has private property. We all own the means of production. We're just so happy, and we're really glad about our work and everything like that. But really, in every instance where Marxism or communism has been tried, it's failed miserably. In fact, it is the most deadly ideology to ever hit this earth. It's a more deadly ideology than anything the world has known so far. You know, people talk about fascism being a deadly ideology because of Nazi Germany, where Hitler and the Nazis were responsible for the extermination of 6 million Jews, and that is insanely and intensely horrifying. At the same time, communism as an ideology going on in that period, Stalin was responsible for terminating upwards of 20 million of his own people. But that's kind of a nicely forgotten historical fact that people don't like to think about, because as you'll see later in our presentation tonight, we've kind of been conditioned to forget the failures of communism, but really remember the failures of fascism. Not saying either of them are right. They hate both ideologies hate each other. They're both abhorrent, but communism, if we're keeping account, communism has been much more deadly and much more devastating to countries around the world than any other ideology that we've known. And so Marxism is really an ideology. It's driven by hatred. It's not driven by love. It's indifferent to suffering. If you were to ask Karl Marx, what do you think of all these children? If I was to ask him about the kids in my school who are starving and they're only getting terrible food to eat, and they have a breakdown of the home and they're experiencing abuse, Marx would be indifferent to their suffering. He would say, you know what? That suffering is fuel for the fire for revolution and our realization of the communist utopia down the line. That's just how it's going to be. And if you don't believe me, there is a book out there. It is entitled Intellectuals by a writer named Paul Johnson. Johnson does have an axe to grind, don't get me wrong, but he gives kind of he looks into the lives of 20 to 30 different kind of socialist left-leaning figures throughout the last 300 to 400 years of Western civilization. And he just shows how these people preached these ideologies that were supposedly about love and kindness and looking out for the poor and those who were minorities. But in their personal lives, they're just absolutely horrible. They treated people horribly. A lot of times they abandoned their families, their children. They were just horrible. And so they're clearly indifferent to suffering. They don't care. They don't care about it on a personal level. And if they see it even at a large scale, if you told Marx, hey, your philosophy was responsible for 20 million deaths in Russia, I don't care. It's on the way to the communist utopia. He's just indifferent about it. So we have to understand that it's a dialectical process. Marx put that process to work in economics, all right, and it has not worked. It's been a complete failure, and it's a very hateful kind of ideology. Now, going from classical Marxism, we'll go to Neo-Marxism. Rick, do we have any questions so far? I'm going to break real quick. Do we have any questions?
Just one real quick one, if you could. Is there a sentence or two that would help me differentiate between fascism and communism?
So, yes, fascism, if we understand fascism, think of fascism as the extreme right wing on the political spectrum, and communism as the extreme left wing of the political spectrum. There's reasons why people, and I don't believe this true or anything, and don't get offended, but there are reasons why people will often say Republican presidents are fascists. It's because they are leaning to the right of the political spectrum. And if they're trying to gain too much authority or too much power, that is in line with fascism, okay? We can think of it that way. It's authoritarian power that's to the right. If someone has another way to explain it, we can. If there are other questions, I'd love to answer it, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. Fascism, the extreme right of the political spectrum. Communism, the extreme left of the political spectrum. Any other questions?
If you think about growth or evolution, are they in their simplest forms dialectical? Does that make sense?
Did you say evolution?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would have to think about that.
Is growth or evolution in its simplest forms dialectical? I think no, based on how you explain dialectical.
Yeah, I would have to, I can look into that. That's whoever asked that question, is evolution in its simplest form kind of a dialectical way of thinking? Put it in a thread, and that will put it in our thread on our app. That will remind me to look it up. I wouldn't think so, but I don't know. So I don't want to give, some kind of false answer. I know that people who like Marxist dialectical thinking tend to like evolution as an explanation of why we're here and how we got here. But beyond that correlation, I can't think of any kind of greater relationship between the two. Anything else?
No, thank you. That got it.
Awesome. All right. Let's talk about Neo-Marxism. All right. Antonio Gramsci, he is the only guy we're going to talk about with Neo-Marxism, really the only person we need to talk about. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian socialist. He was, excuse me, he was arrested and imprisoned by the fascist party in Italy in 1926. So again, there we see that difference of ideas, fascists being the far right wing thinkers and socialists and communists being the far left-wing thinkers. Gramsci, being a socialist and actually being a very smart one, he was a great political activist for his party. He was a good thinker. He was imprisoned by the fascists of his time. And so, but in prison, he wrote an important book, which is titled The Prison Notebooks. And the idea by the fascists at the time, when they imprisoned Antonio Gramsci, was they thought, this guy, Antonio, he is so smart, he is so persuasive, he is such an advocate for his socialism, we have to silence him. So we're going to put him in prison. Well, they didn't. I guess they still let him write, they still let him read, they still let him work in prison. They didn't chop off his hands or anything because he wrote a pretty influential book in prison called The Prison Notebooks. He was released from prison in 1934 and he died in 1937. His book was only published in Italian though. and it was given to different communist thinkers and leaders throughout the world, and they had to translate his book. And it wasn't until 1970 when his book, The Prison Notebooks, was translated into French, German, and English, where it became widely available throughout all countries. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the 1970s is really a time when we see a huge uptick in critical theory and how it's applied to different kind of practices within the university system. So we kind of see there's a relationship there. When Gramsci's work hits the intellectual, kind of the intellectual common people, the universities, the scholars, everybody out there, everybody's reading French, German, and English in both North America and Europe. Those were kind of the intellectual languages of the time. That's if you wanted to gain notoriety throughout the world, you needed to be published in those languages. It's no coincidence that when Gramsci gets published in those languages, we see ideas of critical theory just grow exponentially. And we'll see that in a little bit here. Gramsci, when he was in prison and he was writing his book, The Prison Notebooks, he was obsessed with this question of why did classical Marxism fail? He was a big advocate of Marx. He loved Marx thinking. But what he saw was wherever there were these kind of socialist revolutions where the old aristocracy was being overcome and the people were really coming in and throwing in overthrowing the status quo. In some cases, they were giving power back to the status quo, or they just their revolution just burned out and it became a nothing, or they went to war again and there was civil war. And Gramsci was asking, why isn't this working? What's going on? What's the disconnect? Because he believed in Marxism. He was wondering, why isn't this working? So he finally deduced that the problem was culture. The problem wasn't economics. Marx tied his theory to economics, and Gramsci believed that you don't change societies from economics alone. You have to change the culture. And so he believed that capitalist societies, these societies that Marx saw as a problem, where there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are trying to overthrow them, these societies they retained, even if they were overthrown, strong institutions like family, church, and education. And these institutions, they were inseparable from Western civilization's Christian worldview. Gramsci hated Christianity. He saw it as the great antithesis to what he was trying to accomplish. It was the enemy. And we'll see that in a few quotes coming up. But this is really important. If we're going, Neo-Marxism, it mutates from classical Marxism because it's not solely based in economics. It's changing its focus to culture. And Gramsci saw the problem was you can't just change economics because all these other institutions like family and church that are influenced and informed by the Christian church, they're going to stay the same no matter what kind of economic policy or government we try to push. And so Gramsci eventually came to the idea there would be no cultural revolution unless Christian influence in these cultures had been broken. He believed very strongly that it was Christian influence that was influencing these cultures to the point where they were hanging on to these old ideas that kept Marxism, classical Marxism, from succeeding. And so Marx's system is based in economics. Gramsci's system is based in culture. Culture determines economics. Economics does not determine culture. This is a very important distinction. He's taking Karl Marx and he's flipping him on his head, literally, that Marx believed that he could change a culture if he changed its economics. Gramsci said, no, I still believe in this dialectical process that Marx is using and how he wants to subvert the bourgeoisie. But at the same time, I don't believe economics influences culture, culture influences economics. And so if an ideology wants to change economics, it must change its institutions first. I believe that's my last point on there. Yeah. So if an ideology wants to change economics, it must change its institutions first. Now Gramsci called this, and this is a quote from him. I've got our quotes in a different color tonight just to make sense of it. Gramsci literally called this changing of institutions the long march through the institutions of power. This is important. This is where we really start to see the idea of power coming into the thinking of the norms of culture, the normative culture. These institutions, they control culture because they have power. And that's going to be very important when we go to talk about postmodernism next week and subverting power and deconstructing it. So, but power will be very important going forward. And the idea, the long march through the institutions of power is we're going to colonialize the key institutions of society. Gramsci says that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new world, in the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. So there's a lot going on there. All right. We're going to transform the consciousness of society by infiltrating its schools, its universities, its churches, and its media. So we're going to change its education. We're going to change its religious beliefs, how we understand purpose in life, how we understand humanity, how we understand our worldview. And then we're going to transform the media, our main means of giving out information and deciphering that information, how we find truth. Gramsci says we're going to transform the consciousness of society by infiltrating all of those institutions, because socialism is a religion, not an ideology. He says it is a religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Now, for a lot of people, there are a lot of people I've run into, especially Christians who have a little bit higher education. You know, I've run into a few PhDs that I know personally who are, you know, teachers on universities, and they kind of dismiss my fear of cultural Marxism. And I put this quote in their face and I say, well, what are you going to do about Antonio Gramsci? Because I think this is precisely what is going on right now. And he doesn't even say this is a political ideology. He says it's a religion. And actually, we have a gentleman at Sacred Mission. I won't give his name because I didn't get permission to use this story of him. But he, earlier in this year, he actually left a position. He was a teacher in the university system. He taught undergraduate classes, and he left the university system because he saw this happening in the university system, that socialism wasn't just a political ideology that was overtaking the university system. It was really a religion for people. It was dogmatic. It was infallible. It was inerrant, and you could not oppose it. You could not intellectually raise objections to it. And he kind of feared for his job a little bit. And so he left that institution. He's in the process of walking away from it and finding other means of employment, because this socialistic religion is very much in the process and really has overtaken and infiltrated the university system. So when Gramsci is talking about the long march through the institutions of power, how they are going to colonize the key institutions of society, this is what he's talking about: transforming the consciousness of our society by infiltrating these key institutions of power through this religion, not the political ideology, the religion of socialism. It's very important, because what that does is, if you take socialism as a religion and it becomes dogmatic, it becomes much harder, much more difficult to fight against in the intellectual realm with pure reason. Now, how is this accomplished? Well, for Gramsci, the way that we're going to infiltrate and deconstruct these institutions of power is really by deconstructing all hierarchies within these institutions. You can see this done in education. You know, before, where education was about administration, teachers, and students, we see a real shift of power going on, where there's a much more level playing field, where, I mean, honestly, especially in our public school systems, teachers and administrators don't really have any kind of means of punishment or power to hold over to the students to really keep them in line, to keep them from, you know, acting out of hand. It's becoming very difficult. There's nothing these institutions can do to really get these students to follow the rules. And so that's what Gramsci wants. He wants the destruction of hierarchy. We see this in the family, you know, where when Gramsci was writing, and definitely back when Marx and Hegel were writing, there's definitely male headship in the family. Now, I understand that in some instances, male headship has been abusive, and it's been done incorrectly, and it's been done poorly. And I want to be, you know, gracious towards that. At the same time, I believe that it is biblical, and there is a part of the Bible that says, hey, you know, men are responsible for the spiritual leadership of their family. And we see that kind of being subverted right now in a lot of Christian theology, or being very heavily criticized, very much questioned. And Gramsci would like that. He very much approves of that. He sees that as a destruction of hierarchy. But not only that, you can see it within the church, where there's a deconstruction of hierarchy. Of, you've got God at the top, you've got his elders ruling over a church, and then you've got the congregation, the laity. Well, you kind of see a mismatch of that. You see God being dragged down because, well, the Christian church, especially in America today, doesn't value his word as much. They don't think it's particularly useful or authoritative. And so God's authority is certainly being brought down. The authority, and not always wrongly, but the authority is being deconstructed of pastors and elders sometimes within a church, sometimes because they've been abusive and they've abused their power, but, you know, sometimes just because churches are being infiltrated and there's been heavy criticism. And we've seen, you know, kind of the deconstruction of the biblical model of churches around the US. You know, they don't have a strong leadership team. They don't have a strong elder team that's willing to take responsibility and lead their people and love them well. It's being deconstructed to where the laity, while they're on the same level in a spiritual level, there's not as much responsibility and taking that responsibility from an eldership level. Gramsci would love that. He thinks it's great. That is a deconstruction of a hierarchy. Another thing that we're going to do in order to accomplish Gramsci's, you know, vision of this cultural Marxism, our society is going to become periphery centered. What that means is the people who are living on the boundaries, and I don't want to say outcasts, because our anthropology as Christians say everyone is created in the image of God, but the people who are seen as minority or who might be disadvantaged, we're actually going to take them and we're going to center them. How they perceive life, their experiences are going to dictate how we proceed as a society. It's not going to be the people who were previously in power, the people who are abled, for example. No, we're going to subvert them. We're going to kick them out, and we're going to take everybody on the periphery and we're going to bring them together, and they are going to become that new oppressor, for example. And we see that the oppressed become the oppressors become the oppressed. And that's very much what Gramsci wants to see. And then there's going to be ideological subversion. We've kind of already covered that, talking about, we're going to come into these different institutions of power. If we hold a Christian ideology or we hold a political ideology, we're going to infiltrate these institutions. We're going to subvert them. We're going to be the antithesis. We're going to take them out, and there's going to be a new synthesis that appears. Really what this is the destruction of Western culture. It's the destruction of Western ideals. This is why people who are practicing cultural Marxism can say things like, you can't use your philosophy on me because that is a Western way of thinking. That is a white colonialized way of thinking that was invented 200 years ago. Sometimes they'll say, don't tell me about contradictions in my own worldview. That's a Western way of thinking. And it's really not. It's a huge lie and misunderstanding. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to deconstruct Western culture. And we see this a little bit as an example. And you can go to James Lindsay's his podcast, New Discourses. Again, he's not a Christian, he's an atheist, but he talks about this a lot. He had a podcast a while back about the Dr. Seuss thing that was going on, where Dr. Seuss was no longer going to be, or the company was no longer going to be printing 5 books. And Lindsay puts that in the frame of Gramsci's critique on Western culture and his method of cultural Marxism. He says that, excuse me, I'm sorry. My throat is a little dry. Hold on. He says that Dr. Seuss is a normative part of culture where our children, all children from the last 50 to 70 years of American culture have grown up knowing Dr. Seuss and looking to Dr. Seuss as kind of a normative part of society, right? And what Gramsci would say in destructing that is, we have to find something that's wrong with it, racism, for example, and we can agree that there are some morally wrong things about how Dr. Seuss portrayed a race 70, 50 years ago. And what he would say is, what we actually need to come in and do is we need to subvert this kind of normative part of culture. We need to destruct it. We need to deconstruct it. We need to get rid of it so that something new can come in and take its place. It's taking away the norms, and in this case with Dr. Seuss, the literary norms of our culture. And what this ultimately, Gramsci's ultimate goal with this kind of destruction of Western culture is really to replace the Christian church with the Communist Party. He calls socialism a religion. He hates Christianity. He wants to see it replaced with communism. I mean, I don't know how more plain it can get. And it should make us as Christians stop and pause, being both graceful and gracious when we hear other Christians kind of adopt this ideology, this cultural Marxist ideology. Because when you really dive into it, it's looking to subvert and replace the Christian church, at least in the mind of Antonio Gramsci, it was. And if you're going to talk about deconstructing all of these pillars of society, these cultural norms, these institutions, a lot of them originally, especially in American society, they had influence of Christian worldview in them, and they are being replaced, they are being deconstructed, and they're being infiltrated with with kind of non-Christian ideology. And so you have to kind of stand back and scratch your head and say, can we even bring this kind of cultural Marxism into Christianity, or is it just completely opposed to it? Well, according to Gramsci, according to their poster child, kind of the founder of cultural Marxism, the whole point of cultural Marxism is to replace Christianity. So that is cultural Marxism and Neo-Marxism. Rick, do we have any questions?
Socialism.
Yeah, hang on a second. We do have a question. The Jesus, of course, represented authoritative truth. a transcendent authoritative truth that always was. He deconstructed, if you will, the religious structure at the time. I think the question is asking, is that an example of this practice in a good way? Or is that, the difference is Jesus represented the transcendent ultimate truth, right?
So,
but yes, he was in fact deconstructing a institution at the time, right?
well, was he? Well, because so here's the thing.
Or was he reforming? And is that a better way to think about it?
I think reforming or calling it into question is definitely, or putting it into place is definitely maybe a better way to look. When we're talking about deconstruction, it's not just tearing it down. It's the complete subversion and replacement of something, because there are parts in the Gospels where Jesus tells the disciples, listen to the Pharisees. All right. And so that's not something like a guy like Gramsci is going to say, listen to the Christians here. All right. He's not going to say that. He's going to say, no, we need to destroy what they believe culturally. Now, obviously, Jesus came. He's not saying that we need to listen to the Pharisees for everything. You know, he's challenging them on many things. I would say it's definitely much more akin to a reformation, a kind of a pulling in, kind of like what Martin Luther did, where he doesn't want to destroy the church. He doesn't want to completely subvert it. And if you look at the literature of Martin Luther at the time, he really didn't want a split of Protestantism. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church at the time. Right. And that's the story with a lot of, that's the story with a lot of Roman Catholic reformers that followed Luther, that even disagreed with how far he went, is they saw a need for reformation too. And so I think it's much more healthy and beneficial to say Jesus is more reforming what his people are to believe rather than deconstructing it. I'm sure there are some people that would say it that way, but I believe, I think they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole when they do something.
I completely agree. I was thinking we like that we question things, right?
Yes.
But we question to understand the underlying truth in it, as opposed to systems we may have built up that are not based on that actual truth. Whereas what the stuff you're addressing is, no, this is sole purpose is to deconstruct and then completely throw over and come up with something new.
Yes, and actually
that's not what Jesus did.
Yeah, and actually, we're going in a few minutes, we're going to talk about critical theory and how it's a negative practice, and I'll explain what that means. Right. Jesus is actively telling the Pharisees all the time, you don't understand the scriptures. They're pointing to me. Whereas critical theory and social and cultural Marxism, they're not saying you don't understand this. They're trying to completely eradicate and replace.
Thank you. I think they got it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was a group of thinkers and scholars that are really responsible for the emergence of what we would call critical theory today. It was an institution for social research, so kind of a combination of philosophy, sociology, psychology, they're all literature, kind of all these studies are coming together, and it's really a Marxist think tank when it started. There are think tanks all over where they pay people to just really think and read and write and kind of really promote their ideology. I've known people, there are many political think tanks in like Washington, D.C., for example. I've known people who work for them. I know a guy who's getting ready to go work for a think tank out in California. It's about doing research, reading, writing to kind of promote an ideology or a way of thinking. But this institution of social research, this is what the institution of social research is what the Frankfurt School was originally named. It's become known as the Frankfurt School later in time. They started as a Marxist think tank in 1923. They were originally concerned with traditional Marxism. They were concerned with economic Marxism, what we were talking about with Karl Marx. However, over time, they transitioned, actually in a very short amount of time, 7 years, they transitioned really into cultural Marxism. So while Gramsci is kind of looked at as the big thinker for cultural Marxism, these guys in the Frankfurt School, they were also very, very, and maybe even more influential. Actually, they definitely were more influential at that time in kind of bringing in this idea of cultural Marxism. And so we're going to talk about just a couple thinkers and why they are important for the Frankfurt School, and then explain how they brought about critical theory. The first one is Theodore Adorno. And I don't want to spend much time on him, but he was mainly concerned with individual conformity to collectives, namely fascism. We have to understand something. These guys talk about fascism, the extreme political far right. They talk about fascism and the evils of fascism a lot. And the reason they do this is because, one, they're German. It's the Frankfurt School. All right. Their origin is Germany. And eventually a lot of them moved to the United States or other free European countries. But they're from Germany, and also most of them are ethnic Jews, or they're descended from Jewish peoples. So during the time in the 1930s, with Hitler's fascist rise to power, there's a lot of persecution of Jewish people or people of Jewish lineage. There's a lot of that going on right now. So these people are very, very concerned about the evils of fascism. All right, that's important. And I totally understand. I believe fascism is evil, but I think the way that they went to point out those evils is entirely incorrect. Adorno was concerned with, why do individuals submit to fascist power? Why do not more people kind of revolt against fascist power? Why was some of the Christian church at the time, and we know this is true because figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote about it, and he was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Adorno is asking questions: why do some Christians, Roman Catholics and Lutherans in Germany at the time, endorse Hitler and his fascism? Why don't more people have problems with him? Why are people conforming to his ways of his ideas? So this is a big concern for the Frankfurt School. Adorno is kind of the poster child of being concerned with fascism. He develops this idea called the F scale, and it's a psychological test to see whether or not a person is a fascist. Now this test it's almost laughable anymore. It's been totally debunked. Nobody thinks there's anything remotely relevant about it. However, you can understand this is just really to kind of hit the point home. They're really concerned about fascism. They're concerned about, really developing the idea, can we see who is a person who is going to conform to fascist ideals in an authoritarian kind of regime? And so Adorno, he really develops this way of thinking to test whether people are going to fall into this conformity or not. And what ends up happening, and this is very important, this will be important for the next figure we talk about, Adorno's work is really critical in developing the idea that authoritarianism, the kind of dictatorship, brutal political regimes, those are only fascist political regimes. They are not communist. And that's important because throughout history, if we stand back and we look at it objectively, both sides have dictatorships and they do terrible, terrible, terrible things. But the work of the Frankfurt School was to develop a way of how culture would come to understand only fascism was evil. Communism is never evil. Now that seems illogical and just impossible for many of us, But this is really what the Frankfurt School is trying to develop with their use of critical theory. Fascism, evil; communism, good. So that's all we need to know about Adorno. That's why he's important. He's really the one to kind of kick off this thinking. The next figure is Herbert Marcusa. Herbert Marcusa is insanely important, especially here in America. And actually one of the books that I recommended that some of you look at, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where the writer Carl Trueman is looking at the sexual revolution and how identity has really been tied to sexuality in our Western culture, and particularly in America today. Marcusa is a big figure in Trueman's book because Marcusa is the one who is writing the philosophy that led to that. He sought complete sexual liberation for culture. All right. He, more than anything, he wanted a culture to be sexually liberated. And his work was a lot of the intellectual justification of the 1960s sexual counterculture. Everything that was before seen as taboo, they were using Marcusa as intellectual justification to do the things that they wanted to do. In fact, some of the people, even some of the, well, again, I'll use James Lindsay, the atheist who is talking about a lot of these ideas. He's not a Christian. He partners with Christians to talk about this stuff, but he doesn't believe in Jesus. He talks about how Marcusa was used to really justify sexual perversion and kinky behavior and things that were taboo before. He is that intellectual justification. Marcusa set up this philosophy, and he taught that capitalism taught that the goal of the human body was labor. It was to produce. So Marcusa is a Marxist. He believes in traditional Marxism. He is taking that traditional Marxism, that dialectical thinking, and saying the thesis of capitalism is the body is meant for labor. And the antithesis, the ultimate goal that we want to see come out of it, is really the body is meant for sexual pleasure. And we're going to get to that ultimate sexual pleasure by subverting the antithesis through this, or subverting the thesis, the capitalist human body for labor. We're going to subvert that through our antithesis. So again, this is why I spent so much time talking about Hegel at the very beginning. We see that dialectical thinking right here. Again, it's everywhere you turn with these people. And what we see with Marcusa, we see this idea of sexual liberation is married to political activism. And this is where this is why the 1960s is so, kind of crazy, because they had this idea they wanted to be sexually liberated. They wanted to perform their taboos. Well, how are they going to do it? Well, we have to become political activists. We have to take power. We have to be that antithesis that subverts the thesis. And this is true for a lot of the political activism and critical social justice that we see today. It's the same kind of dialectical thinking that's happening. So Marcusa, he redefined, this is kind of one of his really seminal ideas. He redefined tolerance. He called it repressive tolerance. Repressive meaning it's something that's kind of restricted or confined by force. And so we're going to restrict or confine the idea of tolerance through force. He said that, sorry, there's a bug flying around. He said that traditional tolerance of a liberal society, and when I say liberal, I don't mean like our ideas, our political ideas of conservative or liberal, like or Republican or Democrat or something like that. When I say liberal, I'm talking about classical liberalism. I'm talking about people who love free society, people who value the freedom of speech, value human rights and dignity, value equality and justice. Marcusa says that kind of traditional society values a traditional tolerance, and it's indiscriminate. it values all different voices. It thinks that everybody has a right to be heard. And I think, generally that's a good idea, that even if I disagree with people, they have a right to say their ideas, to speak their ideas. However, Marcusa says that bad ideas, this traditional tolerance is bad because bad ideas share space with good ideas. All right. And he equates bad ideas to ideas on the right, ideas in conservatism, ideas in fascism. And so what Marcusa is going to propose is intolerance for ideas from the political right spectrum, ideas from political conservatism, and tolerance for the left. It's not indiscriminate based on your political leaning. Repressive tolerance is discrimination against ideas from the right and complete tolerance of ideas, no matter what they are, on the left. And we see this, his idea of liberation, and I apologize, this is a long note, but it's the only way to get it to really express the idea. Liberation and the idea of repressive tolerance, it's the withdrawal of tolerance of groups who promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination, and those who oppose the extension of public services. So if you kind of sit on the, and again, I don't want to get political, like I don't want to make political arguments on here. I want you to understand what Marcusa was arguing. But if you support ideas on the right of the political spectrum where we need to maybe have greater controls over public assistance services, or ask better questions and qualify people better, public assistance, Marcusa would say, no, we need to be intolerant of that idea because it opposes the extension of public services. And any kind of idea that further helps those ideas of public services, get even better, grow even more, we need to look at all those ideas with great enthusiasm. That is Marcusa right there. Intolerance for the right, tolerance for the left. And this stuff is being written in academic journals, in books, and they're being passed around like crazy throughout the 1950s and 60s. These are the intellectual ideas that people are trying to use to justify their political activism, their sexual political activism. And so that brings us to critical theory. I don't want to talk about anyone else in the Frankfurt School. Frankly, they're not as important. Adorno is somewhat important. Marcusa is kind of the seminal figure. Anybody who talks about critical theory in the Frankfurt School, they're going to talk about Marcusa most of the time. And I want to give you an idea of how Marcusa operates. So let's move quickly.
Can I, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Before you go on to this next section, Adorno and Fromm, I believe, referenced the authoritarian character. Do you recall that? And is there some simple way to unpack that a little bit? What is that? What's the merit for that?
You know what? Let me answer that question on the thread, just because I don't know if I can unpack that right now. I know what you're talking about. I need to look at it more. I don't want to generalize that question too much.
Good, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll send it. I'll copy it out of here and put it in the thread.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to give some materials that point to that more, especially. So, but no, good question. Are there any other questions, Rick?
No, that's it.
Okay. Critical theory. Smith in our article, he defines critical theory as the incisive social critique which aims at undermining the status quo in hope of changing it for the better. All right. So the status quo, the thesis, is being undermined by the social critique, the antithesis, in hope of changing it for a better tomorrow, the synthesis. We don't know what that better is going to be, but we're trying to get there. And you'll see that So again, you can see dialectical thinking, it runs rampant through all of this. Critical theory cannot simply explain, it does not just analyze and fix the small problems, it insists on changing the entire system. This goes back to where I was talking about the difference between analytical thought and dialectical thought. Dialectical thought, critical theory insists on changing the entire system. Marx characterized, and though critical theory didn't exist in Marx's time, he's kind of a precursor to it. He said, if someone were to apply my thinking to culture, to this kind of social critique, it would be a ruthless critique of everything. It's ruthless. It wants to ruthlessly undermine the status quo for change. And what the founders of critical theory, what they wanted, they really wanted liberation from their circumstances. Like I said, in the Frankfurt School, these were all people of Jewish heritage, and they were living in Germany at the time. They had a right to critique the fascism of their time. There was a problem, and they saw it. They saw a lot of anti-Semitism. They had a right to criticize it. They wanted liberation from those circumstances. But I think they went about it in the wrong way. And actually, some of the critical theorists, as you go on later in life, especially towards the 60s and 70s, they back away from their critical theory, and they say, no, I was wrong. This was a wrong way to criticize society. But critical theory, it's a negative enterprise. And this is what I was talking about when we were talking about Jesus correcting the religious institution of the time, correcting the Pharisees. Jesus was reforming. He was trying to build something positive. Critical theory is always a negative enterprise. It cannot build something. It cannot produce. It is ruthlessly hypocritical. It is always deconstructing the status quo. There is never construction from it. It's always deconstructing. It has an inability to positively create. It cannot create. And as an example, now some of you may feel different about this. I really don't care how you feel about this politically. This is just an example. The idea of defund the police that we've seen recently in the last couple of years because of just the horrible things that have happened to some Black men in our country. This idea of defund the police, it's put out there as an idea of critical theory. It doesn't know how to be constructive, because what you have is you have a normative piece of culture, the authoritative police society, if you will, all right? It's a normal part of our society, and you have the antithesis coming in, defund the police. Well, when you ask these people, well, when you raise objections or you ask questions, well, how are we going to prevent crime? How are we going to function as a normal society? How are we going to govern properly? What do they always say? 99% of the time, they say, I don't know. We just got to do it. They don't know how to create. They don't know how to give solutions to problems. There's no explanation of how. By nature, this system, this critical theory system, it is pessimistic. It is always subversive. It is always deconstructing. It doesn't know how to create, and it's always reactionary. This is why it's important. I've been somewhat personally convicted by it. I've heard different people talk about this in different podcasts, where Christians really need to be active in creating theology that creates something. We shouldn't use our theology all the time to just deconstruct what we see out there in the world. We shouldn't use our theology to just judge people. We shouldn't use the gospel to just bring people down. It should be something that is building up. And that's why really, that's why we talk about ushering in the kingdom of God, where we see kingdom work being done through the proclamation of the gospel. That is building something. That is creating something. This critical theory, it doesn't know how to do that. It is completely reactionary to circumstances that it deems oppressive. And guess what? Those circumstances are going to change, and the definition of oppression is always changing. So we see here, Marcusa says this: the critical theory of society possesses no concepts which could bridge the gap between its present and its future. All right. So what that means is we're here, we're at this thesis, and we're hoping to subvert that thesis. We want to get to the antithesis, to our future. We don't know how we're going to get there. We have no concept how to bridge that gap. Holding no promise and showing no success, it remains negative. It's always tearing down. Thus, it wants to remain loyal to those who, without hope, you catch that, Christian, without hope, have given and give their life to the Great Refusal. Again, this kind of thinking is almost religious for this people. Marcusa calls it the Great Refusal. This is something people are giving their lives to, the continual deconstruction of society in hopes for a better world tomorrow. We don't know what that world's going to look like. We don't know how to bridge the gap, but we're hoping it gets there. And we see this, it's a dialectical process that does not stop. And we're seeing it today with some examples in the LGBTQ plus movement. There's this idea of feminism versus feminism going on right now, where we see a separation between LGB and TQ plus. And if you don't know a lot about that, it would take a lot of time to explain. But feminism historically has been described as coming into American society in different waves. There are different waves of feminism that have kind of rushed over our society. And the second wave of feminism that happened back in the 1960s and 70s was really all about women's equal rights, women's equal pay, really defining what it means to be a woman, how to describe femininity. Now, we may disagree on that definition, but really trying to describe what it means to be a woman. Whereas another wave, third and fourth wave kind of feminism that is rushing in right now and taking over kind of feminist thought really represents more of the TQ plus section of our abbreviation here, the transgender, queer, and everything else that we want to see on the periphery. These new waves of feminism are represented in that. And what they're saying to the old ways of feminism is that you old feminists, you need to support men who are transitioning into women, because these are now women too. Gender is a social construct. It doesn't mean anything. And so we need to support these people as women. Whereas the old feminists, they're saying, no, we fought hard for this definition of what it means to be a woman. We fought hard for equal voting rights and for all this other stuff. We're not going to submit to that. And so you see this process of LGB is the thesis. It's kind of become the norm. And in fact, I mean, we have neighbors who are in that category, and obviously we'd have moral problems as Christians. We'd have moral difficulties in, trying to talk about that and presenting the gospel. But at the same time, it's no longer taboo for two men to be living together. We have two couples on our street that live that way, and it's not really like, oh my gosh, it's not shocking. It's become kind of the norm, and where this TQ plus has become the antithesis, and it's working hard now to subvert that norm into something new. And we see this in I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Pete Buttigieg. He was a Democratic. He was running for the nomination for to represent the Democrat Party for president. Obviously, he lost to Joe Biden, but the Democrats, they kind of thought like, well, we've got this great guy. He's an he's openly homosexual. He's done all this great work in his current position. You know, we've got this great candidate. Well, what happened was the TQ plus portion of the LGBTQ plus movement, the queer theorists came out and said, you know, we've got a real problem with P. He's not queer enough. He's not working to subvert the normal, you know, foundational things of culture enough. He's not one of us. And so this process, this dialectical process, we don't know where we're going. We have no way to bridge the gap, but it's going to keep on happening. We're going to continue to set up these norms, and then we're going to subvert them. And that's, again, that's why I talked about Hegel and why that process is so important. It's everywhere here. We see it completely, and it's completely negative. So I want to wrap this up, and I know I am just over time. A critical theory wrap up. The idea is that Western civilization is to blame for all the aggression, all the oppression, all the racism, slavery, classism, sexism, all the negative things we see in society. Western civilization is to blame that for every bit of that we see in the world today. And honestly, that's just a complete lie. This claim has been used to further attacks on Western reason. That's why I talked about how if you are dialoguing with a person who completely just embodies this philosophy, when they say, well, you can't criticize me that way because that's a Western way of thinking, that's a Eurocentro way of thinking, that's a white man's way of thinking. That's what is happening here. The faults of all of society are really being placed on really kind of the last 400 years. You know, aggression, oppression, racism, slavery, classism, it's all because of this kind of Western type of society. And it's just historically false. It's a distortion of reality. These kinds of sins, these faults of humanity, they've been around from the beginning. And we know that, you know, aggression, oppression, racism, slavery, classism, sexism, those are not Western ideas. They exist in the East too. They exist in other cultures. And so, again, it's a historical distortion. It's a flat out lie. And so it's really an attack on truth. If we believe truth is something that corresponds to reality, something that explains reality, it's trying to distort that. It's trying to tell us that reality is something different than what we see out there in the real world. It's an attack on truth, and it's a hypocritical position because unfortunately, it's just unlivable. I mean, people, I told you about the critical theorists who later in life just turned from their philosophy and said, this is wrong. Especially when critical theory was picked up by political activism, they kind of turned and said, I never meant for my theory to be used for political activism. They couldn't live out their position. And as you and I know, we've talked about this. One of the ways that we critique a worldview is it livable? Can you live it out? And so that's my wrap up for tonight. We talked about Marxism, where we were talking about Hegel and his dialectical philosophy. We talked about Karl Marx, how he applied that dialectical philosophy to economics and against capitalism, and how he wanted to see a Marxist utopia. We talked how Antonio Gramsci really took Karl Marx and flipped him on his head and said, it's not economics, it's culture that we need to focus on. And then he proposed that we just infiltrate these different foundations, these different pillars and institutions of culture, and we colonize them for Marxist thinking, how Gramsci was very much opposed to Christianity in the West. Talked about critical theory. We talked about Adorno, talked about Marcusa, and how Marcusa was really responsible for the kind of legitimization, the intellectual legitimization of sexual perversion in the kind of 1960s sexual counterculture. And so all of these things, the idea that I want you to take away from this is that this new worldview we're seeing, this new progressive way of thinking, these are all ideas that we are seeing feed into this. while they may have not directly caused them, they are definitely part of the origin of what we're seeing today. And that's what you really need to take away. Now, next week, we're going to go over two more sections. One is another idea, postmodernism, which has fed into this new kind of worldview we're seeing. Then I'm going to give you kind of a rundown of multiple types of critical theory that we see today and we're experiencing, because like I said, and I said this in the first week, critical race theory is not the only critical theory out there. There are others that we need to be aware of. We need to talk about. I just talked about one, queer theory, and we was talked about how to delegitimize, Pete Buttigieg and his, he's not queer enough. That's another critical theory. It's another subversion of the norm. And so we're going to talk about just a list of critical theories, and then we're going to start. That won't going through postmodernism and all the other critical theories. It won't go too long next week. Then we're going to start getting into the worldview of this new critical worldview, explaining its theology, its metaphysics, its epistemology, its ethics, and its anthropology. So that's where we're going over next week, and we will finish the 5th week with really diving deep into the new worldview and how do we as Christians respond to it. So that's where we're going. I hope you have enjoyed time tonight. I'm sorry I've gone late. Are there any more questions, Rick?
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions,
Okay.
or a couple of questions, and they might be offline discussion topics. So feel free to say, yep, that's buy you a drink or a meal somewhere and talk, or get a smaller group to sit down and talk. But I'll give them to you right now. The first one is, as you think about people that, at least in their minds, they're not solely trying to deconstruct. So they've gone through, there's a thesis, there's an antithesis, but they're offering something that they think is a synthesis. Let's use reparations as an example.
Mm-hmm.
How do we want to think about that? Are they in this category that we're thinking and their answers are just not sufficient and we dismiss that and say, no, you're still in this category? Or because they're thinking they are providing a helpful synthesis with solutions? How should we think about that?
I would say the question to approach that is, are reparations really the synthesis? Because the definition of what reparations would mean constantly changes. And so even earlier ideas of reparations are still being undermined and subverted today. And so while they are trying, yes, to maybe offer a solution, they don't know how to get there. Don't think of the synthesis totally as a solution. Think of it as like a reality that we want to get to. It is the way that we want to see our society constructed. Reparations would be a tool maybe to help get there, but it's not the totality of the synthesis. What I'm saying is, reparations, while they don't really bridge the gap, they don't bring us totally there. They may be a piece of the puzzle, but they're not the be all, of that bridge, like Marcusa was talking about. Marcusa had no bridge to get from, the subversion to the synthesis. So I would very much question, like, the definition of reparations. It's changing constantly, and we've been talking about it for going on 60 years now. And so that would be the question that I would, if somebody was talking about that to me, I would pose, well, let's nail down a clear and unchanging objective definition of what reparations really means. Because if it's continually changing and it's going to be constantly subverted by later definitions, it's not really a solution. It's just an ongoing process of dialectical thinking.
Right, exactly. Can I think about it this way? All that does is start the next level of deconstructing that then.
Exactly.
And the cycle just continues. And then for us as Christians, what we can offer or interject is, but now look at our gospel conviction. Here is what Christ offers, which is actually ultimately the solution to all these things that we're trying to address.
Exactly, Rick. And my point with talking about reparations and how the target, the definition changes, that, 50 years ago, ideas of affirmative action, which are kind of commonplace in our society today, they were kind of the norm, especially like when you talk about getting certain minority groups in colleges and universities and giving them a leg up and getting into programs, that those were seen as reparations, 50 years ago. Well, it's kind of the norm now. And so different calls for different kind of reparations are now being added to that. So the target, and this is pretty constant. This is something we see across all of these. It's universal. The target is constantly changing. And you're exactly right to say it's just a new antithesis that's coming in and subverting the thesis.
Excellent. That kind of leads into the next question, and maybe the next question is better left to the last session. It's really more from our perspective as Christians. How should we be motivated? How should we think about this? Do we have a desire to save the culture by stopping, slowing the trend, or should we be really just trying to understand what's going on within our culture so we could better explain the gospel in that? Really, what is our motivation here? Do we think that we are here to stop or slow that trend, or are we interjecting a gospel solution, and that's why we're studying this? What's our motivation for studying this?
Yeah, I think
it's the last question.
Man, I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. And I don't know if I'm wise enough to answer that question in totality. There have been some people who've written some really, Tim Keller does have some good work on this. What is our object in all this? And, I think it's gospel first and foremost, but I think if we don't have an eye to culture, we're not going to get the gospel message out as best we could. I don't know. I don't have all the answers on how that looks. I know that when a few weeks ago, I sat across the table from a woman who told me that she believes that she doesn't have a gender. I mean, she's clearly a woman. She looks like a woman, but she doesn't believe she has a gender, that gender is a cultural construct. And I see how her daughter is adopting the same philosophy and ideas, because the daughter is a middle schooler as well. And they're miserable people. They're brokenhearted. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for identity. They need Jesus. They don't need a culture necessarily. And so my reaction to her when she told me that was like, well, are you sure that gender is a cultural construct? Because, and I raised a few objections, and we had a very beneficial conversation right there, where we didn't get to talking to Jesus yet, but she has told me, I want to have more conversations with you. I think that's our end game. That is what we're primarily driving at. Use this knowledge as tools in our conversation, because I very much believe that the gospel goes out through the people in the pews, not primarily through the preacher in the pulpit. The preacher in the pulpit, the pastors, even my teaching right here, we equip and we inform and we help people so that when they walk out the doors into their jobs, into their regular lives, they are equipped to do the work of Christ. And so that's the primary goal here. But we do have to have an eye towards culture. Now, we may not all be called to change culture. I think there are certain people that are good at that and do it well. And I may not be one of them. And none of us may be one of those or that type of person. There are certain people I do believe that are called to question and critique the culture and change it. I don't know if that's all of us. So that's the best answer I can give to that right now.
I completely agree. And I would summarize it this way. Your eschatology is going to drive how you're going to answer that question about whether we're stopping or slowing the trend.
Mhm.
That's just a function of what your eschatology is. Regardless of your eschatology, all of us agree that Christ is returning, and the solution is to proclaim the good news, right?
Yes.
And so the better we can understand the come from state and the worldview, the system that's gripping the mind of the person that is not in Christ, the better we can respond with truth. And so I'm appreciating this class from that perspective, because regardless of whether I think culture is going to improve, degrade, stay the same, what I know is, as living missionally, I'm to proclaim the gospel of Christ, and understanding these things will help me more precisely respond with that, rather than chasing a lot of rabbits and distractions, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think we can speak to this from like a theological perspective, that are we called to change the culture or to bring people to Christ? That's kind of a big question in evangelical Christianity right now. We're talking a lot about social justice and what does that mean for the church. And I think Tim Keller's answer for this was, I'm not opposed to social justice, but if it is without the gospel, then I'm not going to do it. And so I think that should be our approach. It's not a bad thing to want justice and equality for people, but if it's done, especially in the church, if it's done without the gospel, I think it's dangerous, and it has the very real temptation of becoming heretical and a counter gospel.
Thank you, Ben. That was excellent.
Okay.
Appreciate it. That's the end of the questions. I think there might be some follow-up from the people that asked those questions, but again, that seems like, yeah, get a group of folks together. And I see this as a launching point for many very healthy, smaller conversations.
And I've mentioned to you, I would love, maybe we can organize some theology on tap or something around these issues and discuss them further. That would be great. I would really appreciate that. Have I not been on video the entire night? Oops.
And the mic's off.
No, I don't know how our setup is. We don't see your face, but that's okay. We've seen all the slides. It's been great.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I will do better next time. So technology is not my strong suit. Well, thank you all for listening in tonight, and just really bearing through this with me. I know we've gone long. We have good things to come. I hope this is what you were all looking for and wanted to hear. So thank you. God bless you. Love you. And I will see you later.